passed him toward the door with his maids. Arthur stands behind angrily, looking toward him, thinking about what cliché behavior is appropriate for an annoying side character. Meanwhile, Jasmine gets there, asking Arthur what happened. He turns his head and points aside, answering nothing he was talking to. As Arthur turns his head toward the side where Elijah stands, he is surprised to see nobody is there. Then Arthur turns his head and looks toward Jasmine, saying he is gone. After this, Arthur asks her what is next. Did she want to pick up a quest from the bulletin board, or has she already taken a pursuit? She answered that, with his skills, it would be a waste of time to do those, so she had something else in mind. Hears this, Arthur was surprised. However, at sunset, Arthur and Jasmine pack their accessories and move toward the portal. There are 2 guards holding spears standing before the portal. Seeing them there, one of the guards asks if traveling to the Beast Glades requires a license or permit. Jasmine took her license card from her shorts pocket, while Arthur stood beside her, turned his head, and looked toward her. Jasmine shows the card to the guards and asks Arthur, who stood behind her, showing his license card to the guards if he needs to stock up on anything before they head out. He answered he had packed everything he needed for the next week. After showing the card, Jasmine said then let go. However, they both enter, and the Beast Glades with the guards. Also, there were different kinds of beasts, and people stood there near the portal entrance with their luggage. It was sunset time, and flying beasts flew over the cliffs. Both of them move ahead. While on the way, Arthur turns his head, looks around, and surprisingly asks if this is the Beast Glades. Isn't it too peaceful? Jasmine turns her eyes, answering that they have arrived near an outpost at the base of the Grand Mountains, and so much of this area has already been explored. Then, pointing ahead, a man holding a sword ran after the beast and said class adventurers also use this area to train and gather quest ingredients. Meanwhile, the beast releases the liquid toward the man's face with its back, and the man shouts and falls backward. Sees this, Arthur is surprised. Jasmine, pointing toward that man and beast, tells the liquid those beasts produced in their scent glands are used in many potions and elixirs, so there are always quests for them. As the man falls backward, the beast jumps on that man and, while releasing liquid scent, attacks him, sees Arthur and Jasmine pass by him. Arthur passes by him worriedly and turns his head, asking if she should help him. She steps ahead and answers, leaving him. It will build character. Sylvia sits on Arthur's shoulder, turns her head, and looks back toward the beast eating other beast eggs. Sylvia jumps toward the beast. Arthur surprisingly turns his head, asking Sylvia where she is going. She answers eats and gets strong. Jasmine turns and, putting her hand on Arthur's shoulder, says she must be excited about all the wildlife leaking mana. Then she asks him if he wants to go after her. Arthur looks toward Sylvia, who is making her voice run after the beast's answers. She will be fine. He can still sense her clearly with their bond. Jasmine adds that the Beast Glades have much denser levels of ambient mana, so the range of his link with Sylvia will be much farther. Arthur nods, looking toward Sylvia. Then she puts her hand on his shoulder and asks him, let's hurry. Their first stop will take the whole day, and it gets more dangerous at night. After this, they both run away, and the green aura with the strong gust of wind emerges. Jasmine runs away, turns her head, looks toward Arthur, and says try to keep up. Arthur ran after her, turned his head, and looked toward the side where Sylvia was thinking. He wondered if this was how parents felt watching their kids leave for school for the first time. Furthermore, he recalls when he pulled back Sylvia's tail to shower her, and then he remembers when they were happy together and moved for the training. Moreover, he recalls that time when Sylvia, while sobbing, came to him, and he smelled the scent that was coming from her body and treated her like a baby and made her happy. While running away, Arthur remembers his time with Sylvia, smiling and thinking about staying safe, baby. Meanwhile, Sylvia is running after the beast to eat it. However, both Arthur and Jasmine are camping near the stream. Arthur collects the woods and stones to burn the fire and lies there exhausted. He takes off his mask and lies there, thinking if it weren't for the mana rotation technique Sylvia taught him, he would never have been able to keep up. Meanwhile, Jasmine, holding the woods in her arm and hand, gets there, asking if he is a light red core, right? Even though she slowed down a bit, she was impressed. After this, she put that wood down and arranged it, and then she held Arthur's hand, brought it close to the woods, and unfired it with his magic, saying she thought they would have had to stop and rest a few times. Arthur lies there exhausted, and she is staring at the fire. After this, at night, both of them sit near the firewood. Jasmine removes her upper shirt and puts it near the wood they sit on. Arthur was reading the book while Jasmine sat beside him, holding the wooden stick and bringing it near the fire. She asked Arthur if his bond hadn't come back and if she was doing okay. Arthur, reading the book and the answers, Sylvia has been sending him updates. She is pretty happy being out there. Then she, looking toward the firewood, says she would imagine it was pretty suffocating being indoors most of the time. Arthur poofs the book, answering yes. She is enjoying herself as they sit near the firewood on the wood while Avier sits on the tree branch watching them. After this, Arthur turns his head and looks at Jasmine. He calls her name and asks what made her want to become an adventurer. She burns the wood stick with fire, stares at the fire, and remains silent. Arthur silently looks toward her to get the answer, but she doesn't answer. He turns and squeezes his eyes, thinking, shoot, did he touch a sore spot? After a while, she replied that she wanted to escape her family. She remembered when she was at the Adventurers Guild in Caspian's office, and when he asked her about her family, she angrily clenched her fist. Hearing this, Arthur turns his head and looks toward the wood stick in her hand, thinking it is proper, and she says it's okay. She knows he noticed back at the Adventurers Guild, and then she explains the Flamesworth house was a significant contributor to the war against the elves. Their home has produced many powerful mages, both conjurers and augmenters, and their lineage in the fire attributes element is second to none. They take great pride in this because fire is considered the most powerful of the elements, so when she awakened earlier, all of her siblings and her parents had high expectations of her. However, when all of the tests she took showed that she had no attributes for the fire attributes, her family regarded her as lesser. With a sad face, Jasmine tells this all, looking toward her hand, and creates the mana with her hand. When Arthur shouts, she, with a tragic face, turns her eyes and looks toward him. Arthur angrily makes the fist in his hands and hits the fist on his legs. He looks up and shouts, "That's stupid." He understands that there are levels in mana core strength. While she was looking toward him, she clenched her fist, and the mana created on her hand ended. Furthermore, Arthur angrily raises his voice, but it's completely arbitrary, not absurd, for mages to create a hierarchy based on elemental affinities. After this, Arthur angrily gets up and raises his hands, shouting there is not a single element of affinity that's innately better than the other. It all just depends on how well the mage utilized it. Hears this, all Jasmine PFFT then moves her head and shoulder down and sees this. Arthur surprisingly looks toward her and moves his hands down. Jasmine laughed, and Arthur angrily squeezed his eyes. Then she looked toward him and winked, saying she was sorry. It's just that he is usually so composed, and she was surprised he got so angry. Looking toward her and putting his index finger on his face, Arthur thinks he must have gotten upset from thinking about his past life. His most significant disadvantage back then was that his Kai pool, similar to this world's mana core, was much weaker than average. Then she remembers when his father looks toward his injured hands and creates the flame magic in his hands. Remembering that time, Arthur thought in this world with an elemental affinity and a dark yellow core at only 24 years old. Her own family shunned Jasmine. After this, Arthur says it's just unfair. That's all. Jasmine closes her eyes, shakes her head, and then looks toward the fire. She says whether augmenters versus conjurers and one element over the other, she has long since accepted that people are always looking for ways to feel superior. It's just in their nature. Then she turns and looks toward Arthur, saying the twin horns have treated her well. After this, Arthur, looking toward her, thinks that even while laughing and smiling for the first time, Jasmine seems vulnerable, even while she is always aloof and cold. After this, she puts fire on the stick and turns it upward. Arthur turns his head and looks toward the stick. She grabs his hand, and he surprisingly looks toward his hand. Then she extinguishes the fire on the stick with Arthur's wind magic, and smoke emerges. Furthermore, it starts getting dark, and they also extinguish the firewood. The smoke comes from the firewood and lies in the sleeping bags nearby. While lying on the ground, both were looking toward the sky. Jasmine calls Arthur's name, and he responds yes. Looking back, she thinks she might have pressured him to choose her as his guardian. She could have been more friendly, outgoing, and knowledgeable from the twin horns, so they should have asked his opinion first. Arthur turns his head, looks toward her, and smiles, answering that she is surprisingly sensitive. With her wind magic, Jasmine sends a gust of wind toward Arthur's face, and he closes his eyes while smiling. and she lies there pointing her index finger toward him, pouting and saying it's not nice to tease their elders. Arthur, looking up, says he is honestly glad she is the one who volunteered for Jasmine, and she is not afraid to tell him when he is wrong. Then he turned his head, looked toward her, smile, and winked, saying he knew he would need, especially since he tends to go overboard sometimes. Looking toward him, Jasmine remains silent and then smiles for a moment. Arthur, making a crying face, shouts that they need to get some sleep, and they both turn to sleep. With her back to Arthur, Jasmine says it's weird when she talks to him. It doesn't feel like she is talking to a child. He doesn't respond, and she turns her eyes, and then, with a sad face, closes her eyes, thinking he must have fallen asleep. With his back to her, Arthur was awake and listened to her, but pretended that he had slept. The following day, the birds were sitting on the branches of the trees chirping, rabbits were running around, and spiders were making webs. While Arthur was sleeping in his sleeping bag, he suddenly felt that Sylvia was sitting on him while sleeping. Calls out her name, says she was too heavy to be sleeping on him. Arthur pops, and when he opens his eyes, he is scared to see this beast whose mouth and nose are flowing and sitting on him. Arthur sees the beast in a sleepy state, and Arthur quickly gets up, shouting while the beast falls backward. Then beast runs away and angrily sits up. Then, sitting up there in a sleeping bag, he sniffed. He looked ahead, and the fish were being steamed on the fire. As he looked toward the fishes, Jasmine wiped her face with the towel, standing beside the rock, saying she enjoyed the little comedy show. Arthur turned his head and looked toward her, and she stood behind him, wishing him good morning. Arthur rubbed his eyes, answering morning Jasmine. She should have woken him up so he could help with the morning chores. Looking toward him, Jasmine rubbed her back with the towel and answered that he had tried talking him up, but he wouldn't budge. Arthur scratched his head, saying sorry, it's his bad habit. After this, Jasmine placed a towel on her shoulder, looked toward him, set her shirt, says since he is awake now, let's eat, and ask his bond if she will be joining them. Arthur, with a smiley face, answers okay. Then he closes his eyes and telepathically connects to Sylvia, asking her to come and eat with them, but she is far from them while eating. The beast answers him she has food. As she was tearing the beast apart and eating them, the other beast was fearfully looking toward her. After this, Arthur, with a sad facial expression, said he thought she was okay, and Jasmine stood behind and surprisingly looked toward him. However, both of them finished their meal. Arthur gets up, wears his clothes, puts his shirt under his chin, and sets his belt, asking where to go. While setting her belt, she stood her back to him, and Jasmine answered that part of why she brought him to this place was to spar with him. Hears Arthur lower his shirt and surprisingly looks toward her, asking spar. She turns her eyes toward him to answer, noticing his fighting style sometimes seems awakened. Like he knows it in his head, but his body doesn't listen to him saying this. She remembers the time when he was fighting with Caspian. Arthur's head down, he closes his eyes and scratches his head, answering a good idea. Then he heads up and looks toward her, asking what kind of sparring she has in mind. Jasmine turned and, looking toward him, took out her dagger from the belt. She answered that she needed to know his physical limits before taking missions on dungeon runs. So, restrict his mana usage and only use it to dull his blade. Arthur attentively listened to her, then turned and extended his hand to grab his sword, answering got it. As he extended his sword toward his sword, she asked him to use his other sword. Hears Arthur stop there and his eyes wide open in surprise. Then, surprisingly, he turns his head, asking how she knew it was a sword. She stood behind him and answered well, saying he was too practical to carry a wooden stick without reason. He heard Arthur turn his head and press his lips, then extend his hand and grab his sword, asking if he should spar there. However, Jasmine moves her head, answering and following her. Arthur steps toward her, and she stands ahead of him, holding her daggers, and looks toward him. Arthur, stepping toward her and taking out his transparent sword from the holder, sees she surprisingly thinks it's a sword. As they are both on the ground, Arthur strikes his sword, asking ready, when she is looking toward him to press her lips. Then, turn and swung her dagger, answering yes. Arthur, swinging his sword, looks toward her, thinking how long it has been since he has fought without strengthening himself with mana. Also, a white aura came out of his mouth. Arthur, holding his sword, ran toward her. He strikes his sword, and his sword clans with her daggers, and she, holding the dagger in her hand, quickly moves backward. Then she jumps toward him and strikes her dagger. But in time, Arthur moves down and the dagger passes over him. Arthur extends his hand to stab the sword, but Jasmine moves aside and the sword passes by her. She moves upward and extends her hand to attack him with the dagger. Arthur stood beside her head and looked toward the dagger coming toward him, thinking his spar with Jasmine confirmed his fears after his fight against Caspian. Arthur quickly steps aside and extends his hand, holding the sword holder. The dagger clanks with the sword holder. The sword holder slipped from his hand and fell to the ground. Jasmine quickly moved to attack him. However, Arthur strikes his sword to attack, and Jasmine also strikes her dagger. Both weapons clank. Arthur quickly stepped backward and noticed her move. She ran toward him and struck her dagger as the fight continued. While fighting, Arthur thought while nearby, obsessed with honing the new and marvelousness that was magic. He had grown complacent in his skills as a swordsman since coming to this world. Jasmine runs toward him to attack while Arthur falls backward. Placing his sword before him, she twists the dagger, sets it, and moves it toward Arthur. She extends her hand to stab that dagger into him. But before this happened, Arthur quickly pushed aside, and the dagger passed by his arm. However, Arthur starts sweating. She extends her hand and strikes her dagger to attack him on his legs. Arthur quickly stepped backward and struck his sword, which rattled with the dagger. Arthur was profusely sweating, and with a puffy breath, he felt that water surrounded him. And he stands in the water, jumping to fight, and the water splashes on him. Arthur, profusely sweating, stands in the water and strikes his sword. Thinking his prowess in magic had now become a crutch that he leaned too heavily on, it had merely masked his restrictions and shortcomings. After this, Arthur thuds on the ground and puts his sword on the ground, sighing, saying she won. Jasmine stood before him, put her dagger in the belt, and looked toward him. She answered that his physique needed improvement, and his movements were sometimes awkward. But he made up for it with precise technique. Then she closed her eyes, saying his intuition and reflexes were almost scary. Arthur, exhausted, lies on the ground. Then he turns his eyes, looks at her, and says thanks, but he knows she is going easy on him. However, she puts her index finger on her head, surprisingly looks toward him, and asks for scary intuition, but Arthur chuckles. After this, she steps toward him and says he will naturally get stronger during missions and dungeon dives, even while using magic. And once he becomes a teen, he, with the help of his sword, gets up and adds his point that's too long. Then Arthur looks toward his hand and says he is several years ahead in mana manipulation, so he will focus solely on sword fighting without relying on mana. Here's she surprisingly asks if he wants to go to the dungeon without using mana, even with that sort of reckless experience. It takes decades for a warrior to master swordsmanship. She knows he is good, but Arthur adds his point 2 years later. Then, while sweating, he looks up, turns his head, and looks toward her, saying that's all he needs. 2 years later, in a cafe, birds were chirping outside, people were chattering, and the lady waiter served food to the people there. Kegel thuds the wine glass on the table and picks the grapes from the bowl, asking his friend if he heard the rumor. His friend named Terman angrily thud the wine glass on the table with one hand and hits his fist on the table with his other hand, saying Kegel, if he is talking about that famous masked swordsman, he says it's all bullshit. Meanwhile, a guy sitting next to them turns his head, laughs, and adds his point. No, it's true. Then he turns his chair to them, and looking toward Terman, says an acquaintance of his supposedly once teamed with him. He is traveling with Jasmine Flamesworth and is short, so it's hard to miss him. They were discussing Arthur while the two guys in the cafe behind were fighting, and the girl standing beside them was enjoying their fight. Hearing this, Terman angrily smirked, asking that guy what his so-called acquaintance had said about him. The guy smiles, answering that he thinks the rumors are true, then pinches, saying he is not a mage. Terman abuses him, then moves forward and looks into that guy's eyes, splats on him, and abuses him. The guy, silently looking into his eyes, makes an angry face. Then Terman angrily moves backward on his chair, saying that the masked swordsman is an augmenter and the rumors are exaggerated. Then he asks if he has heard some of the stories about him. On the other side, Kegel gives that guy the napkin to wipe his face. The guy taking the napkin angrily turns his eyes and looks toward Terman. After this, Kegel says there was even a rumor that he cleared a dungeon alone. Terman surprisingly asks if that is even possible. Kegel answers B-class augmenters can't do that, even if it's a low-level dungeon. Termin, looking toward him, asks, and he expects him to believe an ordinary swordsman can. Kegel, holding the grape in his hand, winked, answering yes, he would take some of those rumors with a pinch of salt. Kegel stares at the grape and smiles, saying remember that Jasmine Flamesworth is with him. Then he asks, and she probably helped him inside. Termin, holding the wiped mug, calls the waitress, then angrily looks toward Kegel, smirks, answering. Right, he is telling him skull nubs that Swordman is probably not even that strong. Then he angrily gets up from the stool, saying half those rumors are perhaps about Flamesworth. Then he asks some half-wit warrior calling himself a swordsman. Then he raises his hand, holding the wine glass and squeezing his eyes, saying bring him there. He will take him on any day. Then he angrily looks around, asking the waitress where his drink is. While Kegel is drinking, he stares at the glass, thinking he still can't believe how hot of a topic masked sorters are these days. According to some stories, he was Jasmine Flamesworth's apprentice, even though that was far-fetched. But the most ridiculous one was that not only did he place in B class straight out of his rank exam, but he recently moved up to a class. After this, Kegel gulps the wine, and Termin forcefully grabs that guy's neck and makes him drink wine while the wine is falling out of his mouth. After gulping the wine, Kegel clacks the glass on the table and angrily looks aside, thinking if that's true, he would be a class after only 2 years since starting his career. Then he squeezes his eyes and looks toward his hand, thinking that there he is, a borderline C-class adventurer who failed the exam to move up for the past 3 years. Then he turns his head and looks toward Termin, who is bothering the people sitting there in the cafe, and thinks that it makes sense that Termin is pissed. He is a veteran B-class augmenter. After all, that masked swordsman must be a pretty big sore spot for that inflated pride of his. Meanwhile, the cafe door creak. Everyone in the cafe turns their head and looks toward the door as soon as Kegel looks toward the guy that enters the cafe. He gets scared and starts sweating, and this boy is nobody else but Arthur, who gets there holding his sword, and his hair is tied back in a ponytail. Arthur, wearing a mask, stands at the door, putting his hand on the door to push it. Sees him there, Termin smiles and throws the wine glass on the floor. He takes out his sword from the sword belt and looks toward Arthur, saying, well, speak of the devil. Arthur silently stood in the cafe, and Termin, holding his sword, said it was the little swordsman everyone was chatting about. Kegel was in shock, his mouth and eyes wide open, and he put his hand on his heart and looked toward Arthur. Then, looking toward him, he, with a scary face, gulps, thinking it's the masked swordsman, the one they would been talking about, the very cause of all the crazy rumors there in the flesh. Termin, holding his sword, steps toward Arthur, and he also sees Kegel shout and extend his hand, calling Termin's name and asking what he is trying to do. Termin threw the sword on the floor and slightly bent before Arthur smirked, asking where his pretty little guardian was. Arthur doesn't notice him and silently passes by him. Termin gets surprised, and looking ahead, he asks if she is off. Then he smiles and turns to abuse Arthur, asking if he is ignoring him. Then, putting his hand on his face, he laughs. Termin stood behind Arthur, struck his sword, and asked, just because he got a bit famous from those rumors, he thought he was better than him. A guy in a cafe stood behind Termin, fearfully shouted, calm down. He knew he was not allowed to kill anyone in there. Termin strikes his sword to cut Arthur's head. Suddenly, a light explosion occurs and something breaks and falls around. However, the people there shouted and ran toward the exit door. Termin stands there with a smiley face as the light and smoke end. Suddenly, he gets scared and sweats, asking what his sword was hit on the floor, and Arthur stands beside the sword. The floor was cracked and smoke was circulating them. Termin stood holding his sword handle, thinking did he dodge and did he miss? Arthur turns his head and glares at him. Termin angrily looks toward him and grits his teeth. Then he extends his hand and moves his sword upward, shouting a light emanating from the sword, spreading it everywhere he swings its word. Termin strikes his sword to attack Arthur, but Arthur dodges his every attack. Termin swings his sword, and Arthur moves quickly from one side to another. After a while, when Arthur stops at one place, Termin swings his sword to attack him, asking if he is dodging all he has got. Arthur looks toward him, and a bright aura starts emerging from his eyes. Suddenly, something gets slashed, and blood drops fall on Arthur's mask and cut his fingers and blood falls. Sees Kegel surprisingly shout, and the guy whom Termin was teasing looks, and bloody severed fingers fall to the floor. Termin screamed because his hands' fingers were cut. and blood was flowing from his hand. He was crying. His nose, eyes, and mouth were flowing, and he, holding his hand, looked toward his cut fingers. While Arthur stands before him and steps on his sword, lying on the floor, Termin, crying, looks toward Arthur, asking how he dares. However, a bright purple aura emerged from Arthur's body, and he stepped on Termin's sword and stood before him, while the people in the cafe fearfully stood behind him. Kugel gulps, thinking, what is this pressure? Termin angrily looks toward Arthur, head up with flowing eyes, nose, and mouth. Arthur stood before him, holding his sword to ask if he was done. Then Arthur moved toward the counter. Kugel stepped toward Termin and shouted, asking his friend to get a bag of ice for his fingers so they could still reattach them with an emitter, while Termin sat on the cracked floor, holding his hand, crying. The people in the cafe are scared by Arthur's presence. He moves toward the counter and puts the coin, asking the waitress if a sack of rations should be under the name note. The waitress, fearfully looking toward the coins, answers yes, she will get that for him right away, sir. Arthur gets his rations bag and moves toward the exit door. Some people stand there watching him, and some look toward Kugel and his friends sitting near Termin on the floor. Arthur descended the stairs and moved toward the horses. Jasmine awaited him. Looking toward him, she asked what had taken him so long that he had gotten near his horse and attacked the rations pack with the sitting belt. She answered that the waitress took a while to find the rations. Jasmine stood beside her horse, looking toward him and asking why blood was on his mask. Arthur took off his mask to check it. Then, while checking it, he set his hair, answering that no permanent damage had been done. However, both of them moved toward the dungeon on their horses, passing through mountains and meadows where some animals are grazing. And the movement of the horses, those animals retreat, and the horses pass by. While on the way, Arthur, wearing a mask and sitting on the horse, writes a letter to his family. In the letter, he writes to his dear mother and father. He will probably be inside the dungeon when they read this. He knows he has not visited as often these past few weeks, so please wait longer for him. Then he asks if they can believe it's already been over 2 years since he joined Xyrus Academy and explored different dungeons with Jasmine. Then he writes he still can't believe that Lilia has awakened. Uncle Vincent is probably super excited, but don't let him go overboard on hiring tutors for Lilia. Let her train at her own pace before she starts at Xyrus, and it's weird to think that she will be his senior in school. Furthermore, he writes he and Jasmine are doing well. He is even more potent than the last time he almost beat his father in arm wrestling. He just broke through to the light orange stage, and Jasmine is still helping him with conditioning and teaching him what she knows about wind magic. While he has been teaching her some better blade techniques, and like they had promised, this will be his last adventure trip before he starts school in a few weeks. Moreover, he writes that he will see them soon and loves them a lot. After completing the letter, he folds the paper. She sees Jasmine sit on her horse, turns her head, and finishes writing. He puts the letter in his pocket and answers yes. The stable master said he would get the letter mailed once the horses returned to him. Jasmine says Roran trains all his horses to return to his stable, so there is no need to worry. Arthur answers she is right. It's more dangerous for them to be waiting for them outside the dungeon. Jasmine, looking toward him, adds her point the team they are dungeon delving with is probably waiting for them. Then she asks if Sylvia will be coming, and he shakes his head in response. After this, Arthur, looking aside, says that she is communicating with him and has grown wise enough to send more detailed messages. But Sylvia still refuses to see them until she is ready. Then, with a sad face, he says whatever that means. As he was about to complete his sentence, she said she probably wanted to get as strong as she could before he started school. Furthermore, she says let's focus on their mission, and they should hurry. However, the horses trot, and finally, they both arrive at their destination after a long journey. As soon as they come, a group of people sit outside the dungeon on stones beside the hill, and those people were waiting for them to see them there. A guy said, "Look," and the other one stood beside him, adding they were there. After this, both dismounted from their respective horses, and Arthur stood beside his horse, which was setting its seat. Meanwhile, Lucas gets there, saying he guesses they are stuck with more augmenters, and hears Arthur surprisingly turn his eyes to look back. As he sees Lucas standing there, placing his spear on his shoulder and looking toward him, Arthur thinks of this kid again. However, a strong, muscular man gets there from behind and, putting his weapon on his shoulder, says they are the last ones who signed up. Arthur and Jasmine turn and look toward that man while Lucas stands behind folded arms, ignoring that man. After this, the man looking toward Arthur says it's good to have him let him introduce him to the party. He shakes hands with Arthur, and while grabbing Arthur's hand, he blushes, saying a firm handshake. He guesses some of the rumors about the masked sword man are true. After this, he places his weapon on the ground and stands up with his arm on the pole. Then, looking toward both Arthur and Jasmine, he, with a smiley face, introduces himself as Reginald Bastian, and he is a class augmenter. Furthermore, he says he has an earth attribute, a solid yellow core. Then he turns his head and looks toward arrogant Lucas. He says he seems to be already familiar with Lucas Wykes. He is a class dark yellow conjure specializing in fire. As Reginald introduces them to Lucas, Lucas turns his eyes and looks at them arrogantly. However, Reginald introduces them to a healthy man sitting on the stone looking toward him. Reginald says that Creole Masser is a water attributes augmenter and he will be their tank. Creole Masser, looking toward them both, raises his hand and asks them howdy. Then Reginald turns and, looking toward a boy, says he is as if he were about to complete his sentence. Arthur recognized him and thought he was the other candidate's place in B rank back then. What was his name again? The boy, looking toward them, tells them his name, Elijah Knight. Then he gets up and, putting his hand on his chest, says a class dark orange conjurer, a single specialization on earth. After this, a man sitting beside Elijah, holding his wand, gets up from the stone, saying he is Oliver Hembit, a class dark yellow stage conjurer. And he is an emitter deviant, specializing in healing hard. Arthur thinks it sounds a bit cocky, but it's reassuring to have an emitter. Meanwhile, a girl brushing his legs gets up, saying it's her turn. Then, with a happy face, she says her name is Samantha Tempest. She is a dark yellow stage, a class conjurer with a single specialization in water. Then she moves toward Arthur, slightly bent before him because his height is short. Then, smiling, she blushes, saying she heard a lot about him, Mr. Swordman. Please take care of her. While Oliver stood behind Samantha, looking toward her back, she blushed, and Arthur heard this. Looking toward Samantha, she was surprised. Meanwhile, a guy wearing armor steps toward them, and Reginald, looking toward him, says this is Brauld Landon. Brauld, with a smile on his face, says nice to meet them too. Then he comes close to them and handshakes with Arthur and Jasmine. While shaking hands with them, he smiles, saying he has just become an A-class light yellow stage augmenter and is a fire attribute. Here's Reginald stood beside, winked, then Brauld smiled and closed his eyes, saying he would lead them today. Then, looking at them both, he asked if they could share a word. However, Jasmine speaks and briefly introduces herself, saying she is Jasmine's light yellow stage A-class augmenter wind attributes dual swords. He hears Brauld smile and adds that he is glad to have another A-class in the group. After this, Arthur briefly introduces himself, saying he is a light orange stage, a class augmenter fire attributes. He hears Samantha come to him asking for fire attributes. She heard that he didn't have any elemental affinities. Arthur answered that he hadn't been using his magic for personal reasons, and she stood beside him, looking toward him, and said she had seen it. After this, Brauld surprisingly looks toward Arthur's bag, which he places on his shoulder, and asks if he sees that they both still have their bags out. Do they too not have dimension rings? Both Arthur and Jasmine close their eyes and shake their head. Then Brauld turned his eyes, looking toward Lucas, who stood at his back. Then, putting his hand on his mouth, he asked Lucas. As he is about to complete his sentence, Lucas angrily looks toward him, grits his teeth, and answers, asking Oliver, not him. He is full. With a tired facial expression, Oliver adds that he is holding on to Miss Samantha's belongings. Elijah raises his hand and says he still has some room in him. Arthur surprisingly looks toward him, and Brauld smiles, saying that's great. After this, Elijah comes to Arthur, and Jasmine extends his hand, on which he wears his dimension ring, and absorbs their accessories. As he was absorbing their accessories, Arthur looked toward him, thinking of Lucas. He expected to feel even Elijah had a dimension ring. Because the technology was left behind by the same ancient mages that built the floating city of Xyrus, even the one with smaller storage spaces goes for thousands of gold. After absorbing their accessories, Elijah pressed his hand and asked them if that was all. Arthur answered yes, thinking that was all. Then he thanked Elijah for his help, and in response, Elijah smiled. Then he turned and moved from there while Arthur, Jasmine, and Brauld stood behind, looking toward him. After this, Brauld says it seems like they are all ready then, moving toward the dungeon entrance cave, he says, let's head in. After this, they all, holding their weapons, climb the stairs. Brauld is ahead of them, and they all step after him. Suddenly, the water drips from the roof onto the ground, and they all don't notice the water and keep stepping ahead as soon as the water drops drip on Brauld's shoulder. With his hand holding his sword, he stops, opens his index and middle fingers, and signals them to stop there. They all stop there, and he stands with his back to them and says they are almost at the first level of the dungeon. Stay on guard. After this, they all step ahead and pass the stairs while steeping ahead. On the way, Lucas, looking around, asks what this is. There is not a single beast there. Then Brauld, looking toward the empty cave ahead of them, says it's strange they all keep stepping ahead. Suddenly, a stone falls from the roof and thuds aside them on the ground, hearing the sound of the falling stone. They all stop there, turn their head, and look toward that stone. Brauld understands something is wrong, and he looks up toward the roof. As soon as he looks up, he is surprised to see thousands of monster bat runners. Brauld raised his voice. Bat runners and the bat monster flew toward them to attack them. Oliver stood there, head up, and fearfully looked toward the monster approaching him. The monsters were about to attack him, but before they attacked, Jasmine, twirling her dagger, ran toward him, saying, "Get down." Jasmine twirls her dagger, creates her wind magic, and splashes those bat monsters. Oliver jumps down, and Creole Masser gets his shield before him. The bat monster hits the shield and slams on the ground. Braid clangs his sword with his shield and raises his voice to get information. With his wand in hand, Oliver gets up and creates the magic, shouting resilience augmentation. Oliver stood between them, holding his magic wand, while all the other team members surrounded him, holding their weapons, and the bat monster also surrounds them to attack them. The bat monster runs toward Reginald, and he smashes and splashes the monster with his weapon. Elijah created his magic with his hand, while the bat monsters were screeching toward him. He covered the stones on the ground with his wind magic and threw them toward the bat monsters. The stone pierces from the bat monster's stomach, and they all get sliced. Brauld, while slashing the beast with his sword, raises his voice. Team, they all kill the monster with their magic and skill and turn their head to listen to him. Brauld raises his voice. There is no point in killing them to save their mana and stamina. Lucas thuds his spear on the ground, and with his magic, he creates a fire cyclone. He sees Arthur striking his sword and killing the monster. Surprisingly, he asks who that fire cyclone bursts, and all the bat monsters scream in that fire, and their bodies finish. After this, Brauld stabbed his sword into the monster's head and grabbed Lucas with his shirt, asking what he just said. Don't waste his mana on them. That was overkill. Then he angrily looks toward Lucas and grits his teeth, saying he knows what kind of dungeon this is. Lucas angrily looks toward him and grits his teeth. Lucas yanks and frees himself from Brauld, then angrily turns, asking what the problem is. He kills them quickly so that everyone else can save their mana. Braid silently looks toward him, closes his eyes, and shakes his head. Then he pulls back his sword from the dead monster's head. Then he orders his team members, let's hurry before they are up on their feet again. Arthur stands aside, surprisingly looking toward Brauld, and then they all turn and move from there. While the bat monsters lying there were trembling and scream, their broken body halves move toward them to attack. They all turn and run from there while Creole quickly turns and pushes his shield. Oliver, also holding his wands, looks toward the bat monster approaching them. However, this dungeon was infamous for its mysterious inhabitants who had escaped the grasp of death and could no longer be killed. With no mana core able to be harvested by adventurers and no end to the fruitless fighting, there was a reason why the first explorers of this dungeon named this place the Dire Tombs. As the bat monster corpse ran toward them, screeching to attack them, Creole, holding his shield, shouted, and Elijah stood behind him, attacked the monster with his wind magic, and crunched them. After this, they all move from there, and while passing through the dark cave, Brauld, Arthur, and Lucas create a fireball on their hands for light. Brauld notices a hidden entrance ahead of them. He tells them this is where he would mark the secret entrance he found last time. Here's, both Arthur and Jasmine turn their head, and Arthur, looking aside, thinks finally the reason they came to this condemned dungeon. After this, Brauld, pointing up toward the wall, asks Elijah if he can create some handholds. Elijah uses his wind magic to grind the handholds on the wall. Brauld, with that handhold, climbs the wall, and then they all climb the wall after him. Samantha tries to climb the wall, but doesn't see Oliver standing on the wall, grabbing handholds and extending his hand toward her to help her. However, they all allow their companions to climb the wall and arrive on the cliff. Looking ahead, Brauld, holding the fireball in his hand, says he would only make it to the next floor before he decided to return with the team. He then says there is no telling what will be at the bottom, but he believes the artifact responsible for allowing those bat runners to reanimate might be there. He hears Creole brushing his legs and says he is good as long as he gets his fair cut of the gold after selling whatever treasures are down there. Brauld looks toward him and laughs, answering, of course. Creole then turns, saying then let go. He, holding the fireball, steps ahead, and his team members step after him. However, they keep stepping ahead, and suddenly, something sticks to Oliver's shoes. He sees Oliver stop there and turns his leg upward. Arthur held the fireball beside him and noticed something stuck in Oliver's shoes. They keep stepping ahead while on the way. Samantha feels hot and fans herself with her hands by turning up the collar of her shirt. She sees Oliver standing beside her, turns a little forward, blushes, and looks toward her. Then they turn and step ahead, following their leader. Suddenly, on the way, Arthur grabs Samantha from behind and pushes her backward toward Oliver, and he grabs her by her waist. Arthur stood ahead, struck his sword, and hit the things coming toward Samantha. Sees Oliver, and Samantha is surprised. Samantha turns her eyes and looks toward the thing stabbed in the stone. Brauld and Reginald stop there, turn their head, and look toward that thing. Reginald turns and angrily looks toward Brauld, asking why he didn't warn them about the traps there. Brauld answered there weren't any traps when he came there. Also, he was sweating due to the fireball that he had created in his hand. Looking toward Samantha, Oliver puts his hand on her shoulder and asks if she is hurt and if she needs him to heal her. She turns her head and answers that she is okay. Then she looks toward Arthur, who takes that thing from the stone. He holds that thing in his hand and stares at it, saying it isn't a trap. It was a mana beast. Here's Samantha was impressed by Arthur, and Oliver stood beside her and was surprised. While the other team members looking toward Arthur remain silent, then Brauld, looking toward the cave ahead of them, says, "Let's stay alert, everyone." However, they start their journey from there and step ahead. They all sweat due to the fireball's heat and the enclosed space. After this, they all arrive near the heated area, and because of the heat of the place, Oliver and Samantha put their hand over their faces. Arthur stands silently, looks ahead, and Brauld says they are there, but something is wrong. Lucas Fleer Brauld adds his point, asking to let him guess it wasn't this hot last time. Brauld, looking ahead, answers no, it's not that. While Arthur looked ahead, he thought he felt it, not the smoldering heat, but the powerful pressure spilling out ahead. However, they all move from there and get near the cave, and inside that area, the heat pressure spills out from the ground. They enter the cave. Suddenly, the ground starts rumbling, and they all get surprised, and Reginald shouts, "What is happening now?" Brauld raises his voice. He doesn't know if the ground began rumbling fast, and suddenly, from the ground, a monster spurts out. They see that giant monster before them, and they get scared. Oliver starts to peel in fear, and then fearfully asks what this is. Brauld raises his voice. Creole and Creole jump, lifting his shield. He thud his shield on the ground, and water fell on the ground and spread around there. Then that water turned into a magic shield, which covered them. They all stood under the magic water shield. The monster screams, and Creole, holding his shield, asks if this thing is there. The last time Brauld answered no, it wasn't. He heard Creole say it doesn't make sense for a new mana beast species to enter a dungeon like this. The monster swooped and passed over the shield and saw Brauld shout incoming, but he is surprised to see the beast pass over the shield and return to the ground. However, the water shield crashes, and Elijah, looking toward the monster returning to the ground, says it doesn't seem to be after them. Arthur hears this all silently and stands there, and Oliver coughs and clears his throat, asking if they will stand around and watch the worm dig. Further, he asks if they are going to get that artifact. Oliver steps ahead toward Samantha, saying Miss Samantha follows closely behind him. While he has little patience for the others, he would happily protect her. Sees Brauld shout and ask him to get back there, and Samantha fearfully answers Oliver. She doesn't think that's a good idea. Oliver alone steps ahead and sees Brauld standing behind with other team members, shouting they need to assess what's happening before they cross more profoundly into the cavern. Oliver doesn't listen to anyone and moves toward the dark cave while Brauld, stepping toward him, calls out his name and asks him to stop there. Arthur stood behind them and felt something strange near them on the ground. Arthur understood what was going to happen. He jumps and looks toward Lucas and calls his name. Lucas turns his head and looks toward him, and Arthur asks him to cast a heatwave barrier. Then Arthur jumps toward Brauld and grabs him by his back. Brauld is surprised. Arthur drags him backward, ordering Lucas now, and on Arthur's order, Lucas grits his teeth and, with his magic, casts a heatwave barrier. However, they all stood under the barrier while Oliver alone stood outside the barrier, turned his head, and looked toward him while Brauld sat under the barrier call Oliver's name. Arthur asks Lucas to cast a barrier around Oliver, but before they protect Oliver, a firestorm spreads there, and he sinks into that storm. That fire destroyed the whole place, and only the heat wave barrier survived. Bullets hit the barrier, and the heat barrier got a hole. However, Samantha, with her magic, created the water barrier there and ended that firestorm. A rainbow appears over their heat wave barrier when the firestorm ends and water drips. As everything gets normal, they all get shocked and shout to see Oliver's skeleton lying on the ground before them and smoke emerging from his body. Also, the green gem lies beside the skeleton. As they all were with sad faces looking toward Oliver's skeleton, Brauld turned his head and looked toward Arthur, standing beside him. Arthur steps ahead toward that gem. He picks it up from the ground and throws it toward Samantha. She catches that gem and with her teary eyes looks toward that gem in her hands. Arthur asks her to replace the gem on her wand with this one. It is more robust, and she, with a sad face and teary eyes, answers okay. Then Arthur asks Brauld, "Let's move out," and he nods and gets up, holding his shield and sword. The answering note is correct. They need to get out of there before another eruption comes. After this, they all run toward the entrance. Suddenly, a gust of wind blows and everything starts rumbling again. Also, the warm monster spurts out from the ground and sees Brauld raise his voice, calling Creole. Then Creole, with his magic, creates the waterfall before them, and that waterfalls turn into the shield. The warm monster moves toward them, and Brauld raises his voice. Samantha and Elijah are stunned. Samantha, with her magic wand, created the siren's howl and threw it toward the monster while Elijah, with his magic, grasped the stone serpents and attacked the beast with those stones. The stone flying in the air hits the monster, and the stone gets cracked. Sees Elijah get surprised, and Brauld grits his teeth, thinking Elijah's spell isn't leaving a scratch on its body. Then Brauld raises his voice and orders Jasmine and Reginald to go with him, and they both nod. Then Brauld activates his power, and the fire emerges from the sword. And he steps ahead, saying, "Let's go." Braid ran toward the warm monster holding his flame sword, telling Jasmine he would keep it occupied. Reginald tries aiming for the space right between its eyes. Both of them, holding their weapons, ran after him. Holding his dagger, Jasmine created the wind magic and answered, and Regina got it. Then Brauld raises his voice. If that isn't enough to bring it down, Lucas and Note should be able to find an opening. Jasmine leaps from the ground and holds her daggers in both her hands, creating her wind magic. Braid, holding his flame sword and shield, jumps toward the monster and slashes his body with his flame sword. Jasmine attacks the beast with her wind magic and slashes its body with her daggers. Reginald stood in the air behind the monster, struck his weapon, and attacked the monster's stomach. The stone from Elijah's magic grabbed the monster, broke, and fell. 3 of them attack the beast with their magic and injure him. Lucas stands on the ground, gritting his teeth, thinking he is scared. The warm monster blubs, and the smoke starts emerging from its body. Arthur stands before the beast on the ground, activating his flame sword. They attacked the monster with fire magic, but this attack did not affect the monster. See Arthur zip in the air holding his flaming sword, thinking regular fire spells aren't strong enough to injure the worm. So that means he needs to be even hotter. Arthur strikes his sword. Then he searches it to see if it's hot and not if the sword is hot enough. Using his piston stamp magic, he jumped up toward the warm monster, struck his sword, and splashed the monster's fingers. The beast roared, and Arthur again attacked it with his flame-heated sword. After attacking the monster, Arthur sits on the stone flying in the air and orders Jasmine to attack it. She twirls her daggers, creates her wind magic, throws that wind cyclone in the monster's head, and attacks the beast with her daggers. Her wind magic splashes the monster's head and blood spurts out of its head. The monster roars and blood starts flowing from its mouth. Brauld stood looking toward Lucas and calling his name. Also, the fire was emerging from his armor and sword. Creole asks them to wait, then says the worm is fleeing. They all stand in the distance to warm Syl, entirely watching him. The warm monster flees into the ground and the smoke spreads there. Creole turns, looking toward Brauld, saying they are safe now. Brauld answers, let's move. Then he puts a hand on Jasmine's shoulder, appreciating her, saying good work back there. She looks to Brauld, then turns her head and looks toward Samantha, Arthur and Lucas and says, let's hurry. Lucas stood behind them, adding his point, asking if that was all it took to scare off that oversized worm monster. Suddenly, the ground started rumbling again, and Lucas's spear slipped from his hand. Arthur stood there in his power, understanding the situation. Then tells them the worm wasn't trying to kill them at all. It was buying time for the next eruption. However, the eruption starts occurring. Creole with his one hand grabs Elijah and with his other hand holds his shield and creates the water shield barrier to save themselves from the eruption. Reginald quickly moves toward the exit area and tries to break the stone with his weapon as Samantha tries to create the magic with her wand, but she doesn't see Brauld run toward her to save her. On the other side, Jasmine extends her hand toward Arthur, but he notices Lucas in the distance and then bends down to pick up his spear. Arthur runs toward him to save him, then uses his fire magic to flare the fire at them and save Lucas from the fire eruption. Lucas sits there, picks his sword head up, and looks toward him. Arthur's head up and looks toward the firestorm spreading there from the roof. But with his fair flare, he saves Lucas while Lucas angrily gets up and pushes him back, saying, get off him. He hears Arthur standing beside him and remains silent. Suddenly, Arthur's eyes fall on Brauld, and he surprisingly calls his name. While Brauld sat before Samantha to save her from the eruption, she looked toward her and surprisingly toward him. As soon as her eyes fall on Brauld's cut arm, she, with teary eyes, shouts no, as Brauld's arm is cut, and the blood is flowing from his half-cut arm. She says she turns her face and starts sobbing. However, Brauld sits on the ground, Reginald sits behind him, grabs him by the arm, and Jasmine bandages his leg. Creole sat beside him, holding his half-cut arm, and Arthur applied his hot sword to his wounded half-arm. They also tied Brauld's mouth with a bandage so that he wouldn't scream in pain. They placed their weapon beside the wall, and Lucas pouted, standing in the distance. Samantha, with teary eyes, was watching this all as Brauld's face was tied, while his eyes, nose, and mouth were flowing due to pain, and Reginald grabbed him from behind and shouted, hang in there, Brauld. Arthur, applying his heated sword on his wounded arm, says to keep him steady while Brauld squeezes his eyes, crying in pain. After this, Arthur sat beside the wall, and they bandaged Brauld's arm. Samantha sat beside him and healed his wound while Jasmine bandaged his leg. Reginald stood behind him, wiping his hand with the clothes, and Brauld lying on the ground, crying in pain. Arthur sits there looking down. Meanwhile, Creole shaves a sandwich before him. Arthur heads up and surprisingly looks toward the sandwich. Holding the sandwich in both hands, Creole smiled and asked Arthur why he didn't try a bite, which might cheer him up. After this, he sits beside Arthur, saying these are the unique travel sandwiches he saves when feeling down on a dungeon dive. Arthur, looking toward him, thanks him for the sandwich, then Creole, looking toward Arthur's hand in which he holds the sandwich, says the best way to eat this is by torching the inside slightly, just enough for the cheese to melt. Arthur opens the sandwich and heats it with his fire magic. Then he folds it, the sandwich gets heated, and the smoke starts. He sees Creole smiling and requests Arthur to heat his sandwich too. Arthur silently looks toward him and then does the same for him. After this, Arthur slices his sandwich, and the cheese melts from both pieces, then they both eat their sandwich. After finishing the sandwich, Creole asks tasty right, and Arthur, having the last bite, answers quickly. With a smile, Creole looks ahead and says his fiancée created the recipe herself. Along with how he dries and seasons the beef, Arthur sets his mask, looks ahead, and adds his point. Well, he is a lucky man. Please send his gratitude to his fiancée for the delicious meal. Creole surprisingly looks toward him, and then smiles, answering him. They will suddenly turn their eyes and look ahead toward Lucas, who is shouting at Brauld and Reginald, who both cut it out. Reginald stops Lucas from fighting with Brauld, while Lucas angrily points toward him and asks if he is wrong. He only joins this dive because their leader is a veteran A-class mage. Not only is their leader a cripple now, they even lost their emitter heard Brauld sit before him on the ground and grit his teeth. Then he gets up and shouts at Lucas, asking if he is complaining after he dropped his weapon like an idiot and had to be saved by Note. Lucas, pointing toward him, raised his voice. She had it under control, unlike he, who couldn't even protect himself in time. Heard, Brauld angrily moved toward him, shouting he had to shield Samantha, which he wouldn't have had to do if he had stayed alert and reacted in time to set up a barrier. As they both were shouting at each other and moving toward each other to a fight, Reginald stood beside them, stopping them from fighting. Brauld shouted. If he had, they wouldn't have been in this situation as they were shouting at each other. Meanwhile, Arthur got up and stepped toward them, saying enough. They both stopped there, turned their head, and looked toward him also. Arthur's eyes are glowing, and a bright aura is emerging from his body. Arthur angrily looked at Lucas, calling out his name and abusing him. He heard Lucas angrily looking toward him, asking how dare he. Then he moves and steps toward Arthur, saying in augmenter that's only an orange core. Arthur steps toward him and answers that he doesn't care whether he is a yellow core, silver core, or God himself. Arthur, stepping toward him, gets close to him and looks into his eyes because he is only a liability. Lucas grits his teeth and angrily looks into his eyes, then turns and thuds his shoulder into Arthur's shoulder and passes by him. After this, Reginald stood beside Brauld and told him he would treat his wound now and try to get some rest, mate. Arthur silently stood there, sighed, and then looked toward Brauld, calling his name. Brauld, putting his hand on his cut arm, looks toward him to listen. Then Arthur tells him he must decide before they move forward. Reginald has some burns, but his injuries are treatable. The rest of them can manage, but he needs to decide whether to continue. Braid looks toward Arthur, sweats, then grinds his teeth, answering he will keep going, and this will probably be his last dungeon raid, so he might as well go till the end. However, Samantha raises her voice, surprisingly asking how he will fight with one arm. Brauld answers he is still an A-class augmenter, and he won't hold anyone back. Then he squeezes his eyes, saying that Note should lead the group. Here's Arthur gets surprised, and Brauld says he has been the most level-headed out of all of them. Even in the face of unpredictability, he is a natural. Reginald, Creole, and Elijah stood behind Arthur, nodding when Arthur turned his head to take their advice. Then he turns his eyes and looks toward the ladies, and they also nod. Arthur closes his eyes and nods, answering all right. They rest for an hour before moving forward. After an hour, they all step ahead, and on the way, they all stop. Brauld, looking toward the tunnel, says he doesn't get it, even though this part is different. This tunnel had never been blocked. Reginald adds his point. Well, there is no use complaining about it. Then he steps ahead, strikes his hammer, and hits the tunnel. The tunnel gets crocked from where the hammer hit, and the smoke emerges. Reginald, with his magic, collected the nearby pointed stones. Those stones stuck to his hammer weapon, and then he, with all his might, swung his weapon using his impact blast skills to hit the tunnel and break it. A strong gust of wind occurred when he swung his weapon. He hit the tunnel but didn't break. It only got slightly more crocked, and smoke started emerging. Reginald stands before tunnel and sighs, saying all right. Meanwhile, Jasmine taps on his shoulder from behind. He turns his eyes and surprisingly looks toward her. Jasmine is creating her wind magic. He asks him to try it one more time, and he nods. Jasmine runs toward the tunnel, making her wind magic blast, and Reginald sets his hammer by attaching pointed stones to it. He ran toward the tunnel and swung his hammer weapon to attack, while Jasmine stood behind him through the windstorm. Her windstorm gets the form of a windfall and covers Reginald's weapon's pointed stones, and due to both of their magic, a windstorm occurs. However, all the stones there started flying in the air and moving toward the tunnel with that windstorm, while all the team members holding their weapons silently stood there watching this. After this, the tunnel thuds backward on the ground, and a bright light falls on their eyes, causing them to put their hands in front of them. Reginald, putting his hand in front of his eyes, winked. As soon as he looked ahead, he was surprised to see that beautiful place and the vast mountain shining like a diamond. He surprisingly asked what this place was. After this, they all step ahead to enter, where Arthur is walking forward, and follow him. Arthur, looking around, thinks there aren't even any pillars supporting this place. How hasn't it caved in on itself by now? Samantha, touching the flowers, says, "It's so pretty." Reginald, looking around, remains silent. Creole puts a hand on his waist, holding his shield, and smiles, asking how about they take a break. There he is getting sleepy. He hears Arthur think and rest, but then he grabs the handle of his sword, steps ahead, and turns, saying they will not stop. Something is off about this pace, so keep their guards up. Creole stood behind him, scratched his head, and asked if he was sure. Then he said he didn't hear anything or see much other than the grass and trees around. After this, Arthur steps ahead, and they all step after him. While on the way, looking around, Arthur thinks something about this place is putting him on edge. Further, he believes, but what is it? What is missing? While stepping ahead, following Arthur. Suddenly, Jasmine surprisingly looks ahead and notices a man walking toward her through the dark smoke, opening his arms and smiling. She sees Jasmine surprised, and the eyeballs inside her eyes become the same color. Suddenly, something thuds on the ground and heard a thudding sound. Jasmine gasped, and then she turned and looked toward Creole, who stood aside. Meanwhile, a scent spreads there, and the sky behind Creole turns black. Surprisingly, he looks ahead, and his shield falls from his hand. Looking ahead with teary eyes, Creole excitedly asks Clara if it is her. He lovingly extends his hand and sees Reginald stand aside. Surprisingly, he turns and looks toward Creole to ask if it is okay. Creole, with the teary eyes extending his hand, ran toward the smoke, saying he knew she couldn't be dead. Clara stayed there. He was coming to get her. Reginald stood behind and extended his hand, asking Creole to stop, but he didn't listen to anyone and went inside that smoke. Arthur stood in the distance, turned his head, looking toward Creole, abusing him. Then he stepped ahead, raising his voice to stop the danger. As soon as he stepped ahead, Jasmine stood behind him to grab his arm, saying she thought the mist was an illusion. Arthur turned his head and looked ahead toward that smoke, thinking that's why he felt so uneasy. Then Arthur raised his voice, ordering his team members to stick together. This mist is playing tricks on their senses. Then he asks Samantha to create the barrier, and she nods. Samantha closes her eyes, holds the wand, and puts it before her, making her magic water barrier. The water barrier covers them like a shield, and then she asks who Clara is. Both Reginald and Brauld look toward each other. Reginald closes his eyes and shakes his head, answering she is Creole's fiancée. But she couldn't be alive. She was killed in a dungeon. Brauld, looking down, grits his teeth and adds his point. He saw it with his own eyes as well. They cremated her and buried her ashes. Reginald tightly grips the handle of his weapon and angrily says they need to find Creole. Lucas stood behind and heard this angrily, gritting his teeth and asking how nothing was going according to plan. Then he points toward Brauld and raises his voice, asking if they are veteran adventurers. In response, Reginald remains silent and looks down, while Brauld turns his eyes and looks aside. With a sad face, Jasmine stood ahead of Arthur and looked down. Arthur asked her if she was okay. She turned her head and looked toward him, then shook her head, answering sorry, she was just a bit shaken. Arthur asked if she saw something too. With a sad face, she looked aside and answered not something but someone. Her father held out his arms toward her, and he was smiling. Telling this, she remembers her childhood days and tightly grabs the handle of her dagger. Arthur grabs her arm and, looking toward her, says she will be okay. She turns and looks toward him and smiles. However, Arthur says good, then asks about this mist and whether she has a spell to clear it. Looking ahead toward the smoke mist, Jasmine is not strong enough to clear all of it, but she thinks she can create a path to find Creole. Jasmine sheaths her daggers and creates her green wind magic balls. She runs ahead and sees Arthur ask Samantha to open the barrier. She stood behind her and nodded while Jasmine stood under the barrier. Banshee's howl and threw her magic toward the scent. Arthur and Jasmine are surprised when her wind magic storm spreads and crosses that smoke scent. The other team members are also speechless when they see the smoke scent end with her magic. From that, a smoke vine appears. After casting her spell, Jasmine becomes sweaty and surprisingly looks toward those thousands of vines ahead of them. Arthur's eyes are wide open, and he looks toward those vines, thinking about how they missed this many vines in the fog. Moreover, they weren't affected at all by Jasmine's spell. Arthur turned his head and, looking toward Lucas, said they were coming fast. Now was a good time to show off. He hears Lucas shout no need to tell him, then he lifts his spear and creates his flame magic crescent ember, then swings his spear and throws his magic toward the vines. However, the vines catch fire and start to burn, but gradually the fire begins to fade, and these vines are not affected by Lucas's magic. See, they all get surprised, and Lucas, holding his spear, grits his teeth, thinking his spell did nothing, and Arthur, looking toward the wine, clenches his teeth, thinking it is never easy. After this, Arthur waved his hand and asked Reginald, who stood behind him, to protect the conjurers while they prepared more potent spells. Reginald, creating his spell, answers Roger then. Arthur removes his sword, makes the ice and flame spell, and asks Brauld and Jasmine to be with him. Both of them create their spells, and then Arthur turns and, stepping toward Vine, says, "Let's break through." Arthur stood ahead of them, holding his dual magic sword, while Reginald stood behind him, creating his flame magic and holding his flame sword. Jasmine stood beside Arthur, made a magic windstorm, and swung her daggers. However, those wines were moving. Arthur turned his sword into an ice magic sword and ran toward the wine, and they both ran after him. Jasmine throws her green wind magic toward the wines. Brauld throws his flame magic toward the wines to destroy them. While Arthur swings his ice magic sword and slices two vines, he is surprised to see when the vines quickly move toward him to attack him. Arthur turns